Welcome, and for those who have been on my channel before, welcome back. This project is the longest I've taken to complete, 14 months to be exact. It's not that I worked on it continuously for over a year, but that I simply forgot about the project and was distracted with many other ones. I think it's worth the wait, though it did cause a lot of headaches throughout most of the time I did actually spend on it. Herein, I would turn a floating butterfly bowl, so stay tuned to see how it turned out. It would have been difficult to cut each segment from a continuous strip. The approach I chose then was to cut each surface segment by segment, and then dry fit some test pieces. Through that I knew that the segments in the next layer would have to be modified on the cutting angle. So with a bucket of segment blanks, some marker pens, and my highly technical schematics, I set to work. The first layer would be cut with the correct bevel angle, but each subsequent layer would require the introduction of a mitre angle. If you ever try repeating this project without the compound cut for subsequent layers, you'll notice huge gaps appearing on the inside of the ring, as the pieces will not interlock properly. But it is possible that if you turn a project thin enough, and mostly from the inside out, then the variation of gaps between each segment will likely be less noticeable. Each segment was further cut on a bandsaw to give the butterfly joint. Thankfully, using a jig, it made short work of the 80 plus segments I needed to cut. Cup of green tea, all those segments, and a file. Then it was time to neaten up each butterfly. Each piece was coated in epoxy resin. I found it really important to seal each segment to avoid any air bubbles leaking from the wood into the final resin mix. You can see how closely the pieces are interlocked and beginning to curve into a bowl. But without that compound cut on subsequent layers, they would have only been closely interlinked on the outside of the rings, with the larger gaps on the inside of the ring. I have chosen some elaborate projects that involve many very tedious processes, and attaching the spacers to each of the pieces was definitely one of them. I had to use over 300 matchstick pieces for this project, and each one had to be carefully placed in order to reduce the amount of sacrificial wood of each segment as they are cut away in order to remove the matchstick spacers, after the main resin pour had cured. The first ring was dry fitted, and then droplets of superglue were added to bond the ring together. I then only had 64 pieces left to modify with the matchsticks and then assemble. Again, it was about dry fitting the next ring of segments to ensure proper alignment and then positioning, after which we then drop on the superglue in order to complete the ring. Doing this by hand increases the possibility of errors, and any small deviation in those first two layers would have a much larger impact in the positioning of pieces in the last layer. Now, I didn't show the footage of it, but I did use a Dremel to cut apart sections of the ring if I then found out that the deviations were a little bit too great. So I then had to make up my own matchsticks from oak, hoping that they would be more uniform in dimensions and thus give greater accuracy in the assembly. This kind of worked. And the rings are complete. The gaps between the segments are now more or less uniform throughout, from the outside of the ring to the inside. I decided to use a single piece of mahogany for the base and then custom fit it, as the last layer of segments was not exactly a perfect circle. I then waited 11 months before I then completed the resin pour. To reduce the amount of resin wasted, I placed a bag in the centre and filled with dry rice, then mixed up some deep pour resin with green dye and poured it onto the rings. The butterfly rings then floated in a whole new way, so I had to strap them down. I think any good resin project must involve a hammer. It's a great way to relieve tension. I did, of course, remove the excess rice to start with. I was going to show a picture of the rice, but decided to delete it. It was too grainy. The wood turning required a bit of back and forth before I could get started properly. I trued up the rim so I could then reverse mount it and then attach a tenon to the base so that I can then switch the whole thing back to be mounted in a chuck. It was about this point in the project that I realised that the outer rings had floated above the base and it hadn't fully re-engaged when I pushed it down and strapped it into position. But this generated a slightly more interesting pattern to the base of the bowl. On with the wood turning. It does take a while before the cylinder is trued and the resin streamers begin. Now, if you've ever wondered about how dangerous it is to have loose clothing or long loose hair near a lathe, just watch the mass of resin streamers on my arm. Please be safe. The idea for wood turning this bowl was to cut away material on the outside until all the matchsticks were fully removed, then repeat this process for the inside. Hopefully there would be enough material left that the bowl could be shaped and also be sufficiently thick enough to maintain integrity. That, however, was a much closer call than I wanted. It was close, really close. Just wait and see the final images for just how thin I had to get it. There must have been a leak in the bag, which let some resin in and mix with the rice, causing a solid barrier between me and the base of the bowl. It was slow going, and large, painful chunks kept getting thrown out at high speed. At some point during the removal of the resin and rice from inside the bowl, I must have hit a big lump of resin that caused some damage. When I was making some very light passes, the piece was chattering away and leaving evenly spaced pockmarks, which I then tried to scrape back. It was only later that I noticed that some of the wood segments had separated from the resin. Now, this required a bit of repair work and took a lot of sanding to get the internal wall smooth again. Some of those pockmarks were deep, but at least the bowl stayed intact and didn't separate into its separate components. But that is how I then ended up with some very thin walls. I used the same method I have for previous projects that involved wood and resin. So I started at 60 grit sanding, and eventually I could increase this to about 240 grit. I then sealed all the surfaces, sanded again to 400 grit, applied Yorkshire wax, and then a polish to finish. There was a narrow piece of resin where I could initiate a cut at the base, which I did with very great care. And then, once the piece was static, I sawed through to separate the bowl from the lathe. Because the walls of the bowl were very thin, I was afraid of over-tightening the reverse-mounting jaws, so I used the tailstock as much as possible, then ran through the same procedure to finish the base as I did with the walls. This is the first piece for the new year, and under normal lighting conditions the green resin appears muted, but the rest of the piece looks great, especially the chatoyance. The floating butterflies are spot on, and you just about get the 3D effect of each piece. But it's when you put a tea light inside, then the project really comes to life. And that is exactly what I was after, even if I have to wait over a year to complete it. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate your thoughts and feedback, so please put them in the comments section below. Hopefully you'll like this video and consider subscribing.